In the sultry summer of 2013, the city of Jackson, Mississippi, was a place where tradition and faith intertwined, and nowhere was this more evident than in the Bee Haven neighborhood. At the center of this community stood Pastor Samuel Bennett, a man who had spent over 2 decades cultivating his reputation as a beacon of morality and spiritual guidance. At 46 years old, Pastor Bennett was known for his powerful sermons that could move even the most hardened hearts. His church, Mount Zion Baptist, was more than a place of worship. It was a cornerstone of the community, drawing in hundreds of congregants every Sunday. Pastor Bennett's life appeared to be one of fulfillment. He lived in a stately home just a few blocks from the church with his wife, Grace, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith. Together, they had raised 2 children, now teenagers, who were the pride of the Bennett family. To his congregation, Samuel was more than a pastor. He was a symbol of what a godly man should be: disciplined, compassionate, and above reproach. Yet behind the closed doors of his study, Samuel Bennett wrestled with demons that few could imagine. The pressures of leadership, the weight of expectation, and the monotony of a life lived in the public eye had begun to wear on him. It was during this time of internal struggle that Jordan Mitchell entered his life. Jordan was a 23-year-old college student who had recently moved to Jackson to attend a nearby university. Handsome, charismatic, and full of life, Jordan was immediately noticed by many in the congregation, including Pastor Bennett. He started attending Mount Zion Baptist regularly, quickly becoming involved in various church activities. He was eager to learn, often staying after services to speak with Pastor Bennett about the day's sermon or seek advice on personal matters. What began as routine pastoral care soon evolved into something more. Samuel found himself drawn to Jordan in ways that he struggled to understand, let alone accept. Jordan, for his part, admired Samuel's wisdom and authority, but he also sensed something more beneath the pastor's carefully controlled exterior. Their meetings became more frequent, often extending late into the evening, long after the rest of the church had emptied. During these sessions, a bond formed that went beyond the usual pastor-parishioner relationship. Samuel began to confide in Jordan, sharing thoughts and feelings he had never expressed to anyone, not even his wife. Jordan, in turn, revealed his own struggles, his uncertainty about his future, his complicated relationships, and his deep need for acceptance. As the weeks passed, the nature of their relationship shifted imperceptibly but undeniably. There were lingering touches, glances that lasted a moment too long, and a growing tension that neither could ignore. The lines between spiritual guidance and personal desire began to blur, and both men found themselves caught in a web of forbidden emotions. Pastor Bennett was acutely aware of the danger. He knew that what was developing between him and Jordan was not just morally wrong but could also destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. Yet the allure of the forbidden was too powerful to resist. In Jordan, he saw a chance to escape the confines of his life, to experience a passion that had long been absent from his marriage. By the end of the summer, what had started as innocent mentorship had grown into a full-fledged emotional and physical affair. The 2 men met in secret, hiding their relationship from the prying eyes of the community and, most importantly, from Grace. Every meeting was fraught with tension and excitement, a dangerous dance on the edge of ruin. Pastor Bennett knew that he was playing with fire, but he convinced himself that he could control the situation, that he could have both his public life and his private desires. He didn't realize that the seeds of his downfall had already been sown and that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around him. By the fall of 2013, the affair between Pastor Samuel Bennett and Jordan Mitchell had deepened into a dangerous and intoxicating secret. Their relationship, forged in the shadows, was a stark contrast to the pastor's public life, where he continued to present himself as a paragon of virtue. The thrill of the forbidden only heightened their passion, but it also magnified the risk they were taking. The affair was conducted with meticulous care, as both men understood the catastrophic consequences of discovery. They often met late at night in secluded spots around Jackson, Mississippi, places where they were unlikely to be recognized. One of their frequent rendezvous points was a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, where they would sit in Samuel's car, talking in hushed tones. Their hands occasionally brushed, sending electric jolts through both of them. These moments were a blend of anxiety and desire, each encounter a calculated risk that both thrilled and terrified them. Samuel was acutely aware of the duplicity in his life. By day, he stood in the pulpit, delivering sermons on morality, faithfulness, and the dangers of temptation. By night, he succumbed to those very temptations, unable to resist the pull he felt toward Jordan. The contradiction gnawed at him, but the passion he felt in Jordan's presence was something he hadn't experienced in years. It was an escape from the pressures of his public life, a release from the expectations that had been placed upon him as a spiritual leader. Their affair wasn't just about physical attraction. It was a complex web of emotions. Samuel found in Jordan a confidant, someone with whom he could share his doubts and fears, someone who didn't see him as the untouchable figure he was to his congregation. Jordan, on the other hand, was drawn to the power and authority that Samuel embodied. Being involved with such a prominent figure made him feel important, even invincible. But as their relationship deepened, so did Jordan's feelings of resentment. He couldn't shake the sense that he was being used, that Samuel's interest in him was purely self-serving, a way for the pastor to satisfy his own desires while maintaining his carefully crafted image. Despite the growing tension, neither man was willing to end the affair. Samuel feared the emptiness that would return if he severed ties with Jordan, while Jordan enjoyed the status and influence that came with being close to such a powerful figure. Their meetings continued, each one more fraught with danger as the affair became harder to conceal. As winter approached, the pressure on Samuel began to mount. The weight of his double life was becoming unbearable, and the constant fear of exposure gnawed at him. He knew that if their secret were to come out, it would destroy not only his career, but his family and reputation as well. Yet the very thought of giving up Jordan was equally unbearable. The affair had become an addiction, a compulsion he couldn't shake. Despite the risks, Jordan too felt the strain. The initial excitement of their relationship had begun to wear thin, replaced by a growing bitterness. He felt trapped in a situation where he held little power, dependent on the whims of a man who preached virtue by day and succumbed to vice by night. The imbalance of their relationship became more apparent with each passing day, and Jordan's resentment simmered just below the surface, threatening to erupt. Their secret affair was spiraling out of control, with both men aware that they were playing with fire. The line between love and manipulation blurred, and the stakes grew higher with each clandestine meeting. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Samuel and Jordan found themselves on the precipice of a disaster that neither of them could fully comprehend. The affair that had begun as a thrilling escape now loomed as a potential catastrophe, one that could bring their entire world crashing down around them. In early 2014, the carefully concealed affair between Pastor Samuel Bennett and Jordan Mitchell took a perilous turn when an anonymous tip arrived on the desk of Deacon Harold Thompson, one of the most trusted leaders at Greater Faith Baptist Church. The note, typed and unsigned, was brief but damning. "Your pastor is not the man you think he is. He's involved in a relationship that will destroy this church if the truth comes out." Initially, Deacon Thompson dismissed the tip as a baseless rumor. Pastor Bennett had been a guiding force in the church for years, and the idea that he could be involved in something scandalous seemed preposterous. However, the unsettling nature of the accusation lingered in his mind, and Thompson, a man known for his meticulous nature, felt compelled to look into it further. Thompson began his investigation quietly, careful not to arouse suspicion. He started by reviewing phone records that he had discreetly obtained through a contact in the local phone company. What he found shocked him. There were numerous late-night calls between Pastor Bennett and a number registered to Jordan Mitchell, a young man who had recently joined the congregation. The frequency and timing of the calls raised red flags, as they often occurred well after midnight, long after any church-related business would have been conducted. Worried but still not completely convinced, Thompson decided to dig deeper. He began to observe the pastor more closely, noting his comings and goings. Thompson's worst fears were soon confirmed. One evening, Thompson followed him unnoticed and was stunned to see the pastor meeting Jordan Mitchell in a secluded parking lot, away from the church. Thompson's heart sank as he watched the two men embrace, their interactions far too intimate to be mistaken for anything innocent. He continued his surveillance over the following weeks, gathering more evidence. Photographs of their secret meetings, records of hotel stays that corresponded with the pastor's unexplained absences, and testimonies from a few church members who had noticed Samuel and Jordan's suspicious behavior. The deacon's discovery sent shockwaves through him. As a man deeply committed to his faith and the well-being of his church, Thompson was torn between loyalty to his pastor and the undeniable truth of what he had uncovered. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, knowing that if the affair were exposed, it could bring the church to its knees, shattering the congregation's trust and potentially leading to a mass exodus of members. Thompson considered confronting Pastor Bennett directly, hoping to handle the matter discreetly and perhaps guide the pastor back to the path of righteousness. But as he wrestled with his conscience, the rumor mill within the church began to churn. Whispers of the pastor's inappropriate behavior started circulating among the church leaders, fueled by the subtle changes in Pastor Bennett's demeanor and the increasing distance between him and his wife, who had ALS. Grace had begun to sense that something was amiss. The situation grew more precarious with each passing day. The deacon knew that he couldn't keep the truth hidden forever, but he also feared the repercussions of exposing such a scandal. The reputation of Greater Faith Baptist Church, built over decades, was now on the brink of collapse. As Thompson deliberated on his next move, the tension within the church community escalated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would soon shake the very foundations of their faith. By mid-2014, the once clandestine affair between Pastor Samuel Bennett and Jordan Mitchell had become a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Jordan, increasingly frustrated and bitter, had grown tired of the secrecy. He felt abandoned by the pastor, who seemed more concerned with maintaining his public image than with the promises whispered during their most intimate moments. The power dynamics of their relationship shifted, with Jordan no longer content to remain in the shadows, invisible to the world. The tipping point came one evening when Jordan, after weeks of agonizing over his situation, made a fateful decision. He cornered Pastor Bennett after one of their late-night meetings on the outskirts of Jackson. Jordan's demeanor was different now. No longer the hesitant young man seeking guidance, he was someone hardened by betrayal. He laid out his ultimatum in no uncertain terms. Either the pastor publicly acknowledged their relationship, or he would expose everything himself. The threat of exposure sent a jolt of fear through Pastor Bennett. He had built his entire life on the foundation of his faith, his family, and his reputation within the community. The thought of losing it all, his wife, children, the church he had shepherded for years, was unbearable. Pastor Bennett tried to reason with Jordan, pleading for more time and understanding, but Jordan's patience had worn thin, and his demand was clear. He wanted money, and he wanted it now. He named a sum that would cripple Bennett financially, but the pastor saw no other way out. Reluctantly, Pastor Bennett agreed to the blackmail, seeing it as the only way to protect his family and his position. The first payment was made a week later, a sum that drained a significant portion of the church's emergency funds. Jordan, however, was not satisfied. The initial thrill of having power over the pastor quickly faded, replaced by a growing resentment and a desire for more. More money, more control, more acknowledgement. The payments continued, each one deepening the chasm between the two men. What had once been a relationship driven by passion and secrecy had now devolved into a toxic exchange of power and control. Pastor Bennett, already under immense pressure, found himself increasingly cornered. The financial strain was overwhelming, and he was forced to make excuses for missing funds at the church, raising the suspicions of the church treasurer and the deacons. The situation spiraled further out of control as Jordan's demands grew more erratic. He began contacting Pastor Bennett at all hours, showing up unannounced at places where the pastor could least afford to be seen with him. The stress and fear began to take a visible toll on Samuel. He lost weight, his hair started to thin, and dark circles formed under his eyes. His once passionate sermons became disjointed and lifeless, filled with a vague sense of despair that his congregation couldn't quite understand but deeply felt. At home, the pastor's strained relationship with his wife worsened. She noticed the late nights, the unexplained absences, and the uncharacteristic withdrawals from their joint bank accounts. His children, once the light of his life, became distant as he struggled to maintain any semblance of normalcy. Meanwhile, the church community, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, began to sense that something was wrong. Attendance at services started to dwindle, and the once vibrant atmosphere of the church turned somber and tense. Whispers among the congregation grew louder as people speculated about what could be troubling their once inspiring leader. Pastor Bennett, trapped by his own decisions, saw no way out. The blackmail had become a noose tightening around his neck, and the fear of public disgrace loomed larger each day. As the payments continued, the pastor realized that he could no longer control the situation. He was no longer the powerful, respected leader of his community. He was a man broken by his own desires and the manipulation of the person he had once trusted. His public life, a life built on faith and trust, was falling apart, and the revelation of the affair seemed inevitable. What had begun as a dangerous escape had now become the architect of his own destruction. His secret would be revealed to the world. The pressure was suffocating, and the pastor found himself consumed by thoughts of how to escape the nightmare he had created. On the night of October 15, 2014, a violent storm rolled through Jackson, bringing heavy rain and lightning that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Samuel's mind. Desperation had taken hold of him, and he saw no way out but to silence Jordan permanently. The decision was not made lightly. It was the result of weeks of sleepless nights and frantic calculations, but as the rain pounded against the windows of his study, Pastor Bennett convinced himself that there was no other option. Jordan had become a threat too dangerous to leave unchecked. The two men arranged to meet in a remote area outside the city, far from the prying eyes of the community. It was a secluded spot on the edge of a wooded area, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that had been washed out by the storm. The pretense for the meeting was the final payment, a sum that Jordan believed would end their arrangement once and for all. But Pastor Bennett had a different plan in mind. As Jordan arrived at the meeting place, the atmosphere was tense. The rain had turned the dirt road into a slick, muddy path, and the wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie backdrop for the encounter. Pastor Bennett, soaked to the bone, waited by his car, his mind racing with the terrible act he was about to commit. The conversation between the two men was brief and filled with tension. Jordan, sensing that something was off, became agitated. He demanded the money, but Samuel hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached into his coat pocket. In that moment, something snapped. The fear, the anger, the shame, all the emotions that had been building up inside Samuel exploded in a single act of violence. In a frenzied panic, Pastor Bennett struck Jordan with a heavy metal object he had concealed in his coat. The blow was swift and brutal, catching Jordan off guard. He staggered back, but the force of the strike had been lethal. Jordan collapsed to the ground, his body lying still in the mud as the rain continued to pour down. The realization of what he had done hit Samuel like a freight train. He had killed Jordan. There was no turning back. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The only sound was the rain pounding relentlessly on the earth, washing away the blood that had begun to pool around Jordan's body. Pastor Bennett stood frozen, staring down at the lifeless form of the man he had once been so infatuated with. The horror of his actions paralyzed him, but survival instincts soon kicked in. He knew he had to cover up the crime, erase any trace of their connection before it was too late. In the dead of night, with the storm as his only witness, Samuel dragged Jordan's body into the woods. The rain made the task both easier and more difficult. The ground was soft, but the mud made it nearly impossible to move quickly. Pastor Bennett worked frantically, his heart pounding in his chest, as he dug a shallow grave beneath the roots of a large oak tree. He buried the body, hoping the rain would wash away any evidence of his crime. With trembling hands, he collected Jordan's belongings, including the phone that held damning evidence of their relationship. He wiped the device clean, erasing all traces of their communications, before smashing it with a rock and burying it alongside the body. The pastor then returned to his car, covered in mud and drenched from head to toe. His mind was a blur of panic and disbelief as he drove away from the scene, the storm still raging around him. But the act of covering up the murder was not enough to silence the guilt that now consumed him. The cracks in Pastor Bennett's carefully constructed facade began to show almost immediately. He returned home, trying to maintain his composure, but the weight of what he had done was unbearable. The guilt gnawed at him, haunting his every thought. He began to withdraw further, his once commanding presence at the pulpit now reduced to a shadow of its former self. The community noticed the change in their pastor, but no one could have guessed the true reason behind his decline. Samuel Bennett, once a man of God, was now a murderer, burdened by the knowledge that the truth would inevitably come to light. The storm that had raged outside on that fateful night was nothing compared to the storm now brewing inside him, threatening to destroy everything he had ever known. Jordan Mitchell's sudden disappearance on that stormy October night in 2014 did not go unnoticed. His family, alarmed by his lack of contact, reported him missing within days. Jordan had always been close with his mother, regularly checking in with her even when he was out of town. When the calls and messages stopped abruptly, her concern quickly escalated into fear. The Jackson Police Department responded swiftly, initiating a missing person investigation that would soon unravel one of the most shocking scandals in the city's history. Detective Lisa Morgan was assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years on the force. She approached Jordan's disappearance with methodical precision. Her first step was to dig into Jordan's recent activities, his friendships, his work, and any potential relationships that might offer clues. It wasn't long before she discovered Jordan's involvement with Pastor Samuel Bennett. The connection between Jordan and the pastor was initially just a thread in the larger tapestry of the investigation, but it quickly became a focal point. Detective Morgan obtained Jordan's phone records, which revealed a series of text messages exchanged between him and Pastor Bennett. The messages, while carefully worded, hinted at a relationship far more personal than what one might expect between a pastor and a member of his congregation. The tone of the messages suggested intimacy, and the frequency of late-night exchanges raised red flags. As Detective Morgan delved deeper, she began interviewing members of the congregation, including those who had seen Jordan and the pastor together. Witnesses spoke of secretive meetings, hushed conversations, and a noticeable tension between the two men. One church deacon, who had been investigating on his own after receiving an anonymous tip, reluctantly shared what he knew with the detective. His findings, though incomplete, corroborated the growing suspicion that Pastor Bennett and Jordan Mitchell had been involved in a clandestine affair. The investigation took a critical turn when Detective Morgan traced a series of financial transactions from Pastor Bennett's personal accounts to an account in Jordan's name. The payments were substantial and irregular, coinciding with the time frame when the blackmail threats began. This financial link provided a concrete motive, suggesting that the pastor had been paying to keep their affair hidden. By November 2014, the mounting evidence pointed squarely at Pastor Bennett as the prime suspect in Jordan's disappearance. Detective Morgan knew she needed more than just circumstantial evidence to make an arrest, so she pushed harder, re-interviewing witnesses and scouring the pastor's digital footprint. In the course of her investigation, she uncovered more text messages, this time from a secondary phone that Jordan had used to communicate with the pastor. These messages were explicit, detailing not only their relationship but also the growing tension as Jordan pressured Bennett for more money. The messages painted a picture of a man feeling trapped and desperate, and another man losing control of the situation. With the evidence in hand, Detective Morgan obtained a search warrant for the pastor's home and office. The search yielded more incriminating evidence, including a journal in which Pastor Bennett had written about his guilt and fear of losing everything. The entries, though vague, hinted at actions taken in desperation and spoke of a burden that was too heavy to bear. The arrest of Pastor Samuel Bennett on December 2, 2014, sent shock waves through the community. News of his involvement in Jordan Mitchell's disappearance and the affair that preceded it dominated local headlines. The media swarmed the courthouse as Bennett was taken into custody, his face a mixture of resignation and fear. The community that had once revered him now found itself grappling with disbelief and betrayal. How could their spiritual leader, a man they had trusted with their souls, be capable of such deceit? The church, once a sanctuary, became the epicenter of a scandal that rocked Jackson to its core. As Pastor Bennett sat in a holding cell awaiting the charges that would soon be brought against him, the full extent of his double life began to emerge. The evidence was damning, and the truth was undeniable. The man who had preached righteousness and virtue had been living a lie, one that had cost an innocent man his life. The investigation, though far from over, had laid bare the dark secrets that Pastor Bennett had fought so hard to conceal. Now, with the weight of the law pressing down on him, the pastor would have to face the consequences of his actions in a court of law, with the eyes of the entire community watching. The trial of Pastor Samuel Bennett began on February 16, 2015, in the Hinds County Courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi. The case had drawn national attention, with media outlets from across the country descending on the small southern city to cover the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including members of Bennett's congregation, curious onlookers, and journalists eager to report every detail of the case. The trial was poised to be one of the most sensational in Mississippi's recent history. Given the high-profile nature of the defendant and the shocking allegations against him, the prosecution, led by District Attorney Karen Jackson, presented a meticulously detailed case against Pastor Bennett. Jackson, known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp legal mind, outlined the evidence in her opening statement, describing the affair between Bennett and Jordan Mitchell as the catalyst for a chain of events that culminated in murder. The prosecution argued that Bennett, a man of God who was supposed to uphold moral integrity, had instead been living a double life, driven by lust, fear, and ultimately desperation. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented text messages between Bennett and Jordan, financial records showing the payments made to Jordan, and testimonies from church members who had noticed the secretive behavior. The most damning piece of evidence was a journal found in Bennett's office, where he had written about his fears of exposure and the lengths he would go to protect his reputation. The prosecution called a series of witnesses, including Jordan's family, who spoke of their anguish and the sudden change in Jordan's behavior after he became involved with Bennett. Key testimony came from Detective Lisa Morgan, the lead investigator in the case. She walked the jury through the timeline of events leading up to Jordan's disappearance, the discovery of the financial transactions, and the subsequent arrest of Pastor Bennett. Morgan's testimony was clear, concise, and left little doubt about Bennett's guilt. She recounted the night of the murder, piecing together how Bennett had lured Jordan to a remote location under the guise of a final payment, and then, in a fit of panic and fear, killed him to silence the threat. The defense, led by attorney Richard Malone, faced an uphill battle. Malone tried to portray Bennett as a man under extreme pressure, arguing that he acted in self-defense when Jordan became aggressive during their final meeting. However, the lack of evidence to support this claim made it difficult to convince the jury. The defense also attempted to discredit the prosecution's witnesses, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. The testimonies of church members who described Bennett's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murder only served to strengthen the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, Bennett's demeanor was one of stoic resignation. He rarely made eye contact with the jury and spent much of the trial staring at the floor. His wife, seated behind him in the courtroom, was a constant presence, her face a mask of anguish as the sordid details of her husband's double life were laid bare for all to see. The once revered pastor, who had stood at the pulpit and preached about righteousness and virtue, was now exposed as a man who had succumbed to his darkest desires. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, and on March 10, 2015, the jury retired to deliberate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as everyone waited for the verdict. After only 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Pastor Samuel Bennett was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with a collective gasp from the spectators, followed by silence as the weight of the decision sank in. Bennett showed little reaction as the verdict was read, his expression blank. However, his wife broke down in tears, her sobs echoing in the otherwise silent courtroom. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the crime, sentenced Bennett to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that the once revered pastor would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the life he had taken and the trust he had shattered. The aftermath of the trial left the community reeling. The church that Bennett had led was fractured, with many members leaving in the wake of the scandal. The congregation was left to pick up the pieces, their faith in their leader and, in some cases, their faith in God deeply shaken. The story of Pastor Bennett became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how power, secrecy, and unchecked desire could lead to the most tragic of downfalls. As the media coverage subsided and the courthouse returned to its usual routine, the legacy of the case lingered in Jackson. The once quiet southern city would never forget the trial that exposed the dark secrets of its most respected leader, forever changing the lives of those involved and casting a long shadow over the community.